Buenas noches. Disculpen la tardanza, problemas técnicos. Nos pasa en tecnología con alguna frecuencia. Bienvenidos al seminario de servicios avanzados SISAP. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Hemos escogido 11 temas que creemos o estamos seguros que van a ser del interés de todos, especialmente ahora en tiempos de pandemia. Nos sentimos muy honrados y orgullosos de poder compartir este escenario con profesionales de clase mundial. Amigos, algunos de hace muchas décadas, no tantas décadas, pero décadas, y colegas de gran trayectoria global, que generosamente compartirán su conocimiento y experiencia con nosotros. Hemos hecho nuestro roadshow por los últimos 8 años. Y el año pasado hicimos nuestro tour de servicios. Este año, por razones pandémicas, no vamos a poder estar viajando a todos los países como nos encantaría. Entonces lo haremos virtual. Comenzamos durante la pandemia en mayo con una serie de seminarios, un seminario con una serie de actividades que llamamos el Cybersecurity Essentials, que constó de 10 sesiones donde nuestros talentos compartieron conocimiento. Y tuvimos bastante éxito. Más de 500 personas estuvieron inscritas y recibieron diplomas de participación de más del 80% de las charlas. Esta vez, en este seminario que se llama Seminario de Servicios Avanzados, la diferencia es que estamos invitando a personas de gran trayectoria, de gran experiencia a nivel global, a que conversen con nosotros y que nos cuenten las cosas que de veras necesitamos saber de los temas que ya escogimos. Hoy abordaremos un tema fundamental y con esto comenzamos la serie de 11 charlas. El tema es estándares de seguridad. Todos necesitamos en nuestras organizaciones algún marco de referencia para poder crear y establecer y controlar la seguridad de nuestras organizaciones. Y algunos tienen que, además de estos estándares o estos marcos de referencia, tienen que cumplir con regulaciones del Estado. Y en adición, algunos tienen que cumplir también con marcos comerciales, como PCI, como SWIFT y algunos otros. El ingeniero Cristian Nane, con más de 12 años de experiencia internacional en seguridad de la información, charlará con Sherry Ramsey y Mike García, ambos colaboradores de Cambridge Global Advisors, acerca de los estándares más relevantes y cómo aplicarlos a sus organizaciones. Hemos tenido la oportunidad y el honor de trabajar en proyectos con Sherry y Mike. Su vasta experiencia y conocimiento los hace ideales para conversar de este tema. Me voy a pasar a inglés para leer un resumen, breves resúmenes de sus biografías, porque tienen muchísima experiencia y los vamos a cortar. Así es que comenzamos en inglés. Para los que necesiten la traducción, por favor, pásense al canal de castellano. Sherry Ramsey is a consultant engaged in cybersecurity strategy development and planning, cyber assessments, leadership partnership development, and marketing and development of cybersecurity tools and security operations centers. She is on the board of advisors of Virginia Tech's Hume Research Center, the University of Chicago Cyber Policy Initiative, Cyberdome, and TrueStar Technology. She is also a sought-after speaker in cybersecurity threats and issues. Ms. Ramsey is the former director of the National Security Agency, NSA, Threat Operations Center, ATT&CK. She discovered and She led discovery and characterization of threats to national security systems, provided situational awareness for those threats, and coordinated actionable information to counter those threats with the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and FBI. She also served as senior leader in NSA's Signal Intelligence Directorate, Technology Directorate, and Information Assurance Directorate. Ms. Ramsey received the Department of Defense Distinguished Civilian Service Award, the highest award given to a Department of Defense civilian. The Exceptional Civilian Service Award, the highest award given to an NSA civilian. The NSA Meritorious Civilian Service Award twice, the second highest award given to an NSA civilian. The Presidential Rank Award, the National Intelligence Meritorious Unit Citation, the Luis Tordella Award, the AFCEA Meritorious Service to the Intelligence Community Award. She received the Women's Leadership Award from the Congressional Bipartisan Smart Caucus. Ms. Ramsey graduated magna cum laude from the University of Georgia. She graduated with honors from the Johns Hopkins University in master's. She earned a second master's degree from the Industrial College of Armed Forces, National Defense University. She received a certificate in leadership from the University of Virginia. As we can see from her biography, Sherry has been working her life in security and intelligence, and she knows as the best do how this began and how it has developed. Michael Eric Garcia. Mike Garcia is an economist and cybersecurity expert. After almost a decade with the US federal government, he has spent the last 3 years helping private and public entities with cybersecurity strategy, policy, identity, and access management, and election security. From 2011 to 2017, Mike worked with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, ultimately directing its Trusted Identities Group. Before that, he served as a senior cybersecurity strategist for the Department of Homeland Security. Mike has also worked as an instructor of agribusiness management at Ohio State, a market research manager and software engineer. Mike's doctorate is in agricultural, environmental, and development economics from Ohio State, with focus in information security economics and resource economics. Additionally, Mike holds a master's in economics and MBA from Ohio State, and a BA in economics, and a BS in computer science, a BS in education from University of Dayton. He is native of Cleveland, Ohio, and he won't let you forget it. So we will continue in English for the rest of the day or the session. And now there will be a short video of Sistemas Aplicativos before we change the speakers. So thank you very much again for being with us, and we certainly hope that this will be lots of information that will be useful for you in your organizations. Thank you very much.
SISAP, Sistemas Aplicativos. Durante este tiempo, hemos incursionado en muchas áreas de la tecnología de la información, liderando el mercado a través de la innovación, calidad y servicio al cliente, ofreciendo los siguientes servicios. Arquitectura. RIF-DR, equipo de respuesta a incidentes forenses Data Recovery. Ingeniería y soporte. PMO. SOC. Consultoría. Outsourcing. Capacitaciones. Y Customer Success. Realizamos operaciones en distintos países como Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panamá, y República Dominicana. Además, nuestros clientes están situados en Estados Unidos, México, Centroamérica, Colombia, Ecuador, Perú, Chile, Brasil y otros países. Nuestro SOC en Guatemala se sitúa en el edificio Forum Zona Viva. Además, contamos con un segundo SOC en la ciudad de Panamá. Actualmente SISAP está certificado como CERT por parte de la Universidad de Carnegie Mellon, que a través de su software, Engineering Institute, nos ha dado entrada a su red de CERTs. Nuestro personal cuenta con más de 70 certificaciones de SIEM, Malware Reverse Engineering, Penetration Testing, Forensics, Incident Response, entre otras. SISAP, con más de 150 ingenieros trabajando para sus socios comerciales, con más de 1000 certificaciones, alianzas estratégicas con Nova Coast, IBM, Verizon, contributor de Verizon, en donde SISAP contribuye generando reportes e información local recolectada, alimentando el reporte de este año, poniendo en el mapa la región de Centroamérica y el Caribe, que no habían tenido datos significativos anteriormente. También estamos certificados por FIRST, que es una confederación internacional de equipos confiables de respuesta a incidentes informáticos, que manejan cooperativamente incidentes de seguridad informática y promueven programas de prevención de incidentes. SISAP, Sistemas Aplicativos.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Sherry. Thank you for being this evening with us. How are you guys doing?
Good, thank you.
Doing really well, thank you.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about standards and what is the importance of standards in cybersecurity. So let's start off with you, Mike. Why do you think standardization in cybersecurity is important?
So I think the first thing to think about is what is a standard? Why do they exist? And so there are, people that know standards well will tell you that there are a number of different types, but I like to think of them in two different categories. There are proactive standards that you write to try to get people to adopt new technologies for compatibility, interoperability between systems. And then there are standards that are more reactionary in nature. And security standards almost inevitably fall into the second one. So the reason that security standards really exist is because somebody else failed. An attack was successful, something went wrong. And as a result, we've seen this enough times that we have a standard approach to defending against it. And so when we talk about building standards for security, your real choice as to whether you're going to adopt a standard or not is whether you want to experience all of those failures yourself, or if you want to avoid them by leveraging what others have already learned and have developed standards for. So that's the primary reason to be thinking about the standard and what you want, whether you want to adopt it. But there's more to it than that. It's really, if you could sit down and you could work through scenarios and threats and all the information that's out there and develop your own security approaches, as you have to customize no matter what you do. But if you don't start with this standard approach, it becomes extremely expensive. You have to go through all of the pain of creating creating an approach that is going to mitigate risks when there are already standards out there that exist. And so typically, I don't think of standards in terms of compliance so much as I do in terms of being an effective investment. And so deploying standards or controls or guidance, depending on the technical terms, have a difference to them, but today we'll just kind of talk about them all as standards. It's a lot cheaper, it's a lot faster, and it's a lot more reliable. And the other aspect of that is that it allows you to communicate with others. And so, let's say, for instance, that you have an incident. And because of that incident, you need to bring in additional support. So this is having operational impact. You're not allowed to conduct the business that you need to conduct because this incident has been so significant. You don't want to be in a position where you bring someone in and you have to train them on this highly customized security structure that you have built. The more that it can be standardized, the more that those that are supporting you can understand it because they've seen it before and they know what to do under certain attack circumstances, then the better the mitigations they can take, the faster the mitigations they can take, and the quicker they can get you back up and running again. And so all of these custom build controls have a cost associated with them, especially when there's an incident and it's really costing you money. And so the importance of implementing standards is really, I can't underscore it enough, because it gives you this approach that is standard. And it is something that is understandable, and you can evolve along with everyone else as we learn more about our attackers and adversaries and address and mitigate the risks that they present us.
Thank you, Mike. So Sherry, given that standardization is so important, as Mike just described, in your opinion, what would be the most important standards for cybersecurity? And could you give us a little bit of insight in each of these?
Absolutely, Christian. Over the years, there have been a number of standards that have been developed and used to varying degrees of success. But what I'd like to focus on today are 3 standards that I think are really important. And they actually are evolving together, so they're consistent with each other. So the first one of those is the Center for Internet Security's 20 controls. The controls are a recommended set of actions for cyber defense that provides specific and actionable, and I think that's a key phrase right there, specific and actionable ways to stop today's, really their most pervasive and dangerous attacks. A principal benefit of the controls is that they prioritize and focus a small number of actions that have very high payoff results. The controls are effective because they are derived from the most common attack vectors highlighted in a variety of threat reports around, specifically the Verizon threat report, and vetted across an international and global community of government and industry practitioners. The second one that I'd like to point out is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. This framework is a globally accessible knowledge base. What it is a matrix that contains adversary tactics and techniques based on real-world observations. This comprehensive matrix is used as a foundation for the development of threat models and methodologies in the private sector, by governments around the world, and in the cybersecurity product and service community. It's actually used by threat hunters, red teamers, and network defenders to better classify attacks so they know how to defend against them. The Center for Internet Security and the MITRE team to develop the attack framework are actually working together today to ensure consistency between these standards. The third standard that I'd like to point out is the NIST framework. This framework integrates industry standards and best practices to help organizations manage their cybersecurity risks. It gives us a common language that allows staff at all levels within an organization and at all points within the supply chain to develop a shared understanding of their security risks. Often, as practitioners, we have a hard time categorizing and explaining cybersecurity risks up in the C-suite or to our suppliers or others. And what this does is it gives us a common way to identify and talk about that risk. The initial and the primary stakeholders for the NIST framework were U.S. private sector owners and operators of critical infrastructure. So that's why it was so important. It was for energy, for water, for oil, for gas. But since this initial development, the user base has grown considerably and really includes communities and organizations of all types across the globe. I would also say that the NIST framework has been revised several times, and it's also consistent with the MITRE ATT&CK framework and with the CIS 20 control. I know often when we're trying to implement standards, we're trying to decide which ones to use, and often they're not consistent with each other. So what I'd like to offer at this point is these are 3 of the key standards that we all should consider using, and they are very consistent with each other.
Thank you, Sherry. And Mike, here in the region, we have a lot of our customers actually that are trying to implement ISO 27001, and we would like to know the key differences between NIST cybersecurity framework and ISO 27000, and why should I choose one above the other one?
Sure, yeah, it's a great question, and it's a common question, not just in Latin America, but across the globe. So ISO 27001 is part of the ISO 27000 suite, which is a couple dozen different standards. And they're very much focused on building the systems that are used for the management of IT resources. So they're extremely well known. They're globally deployed. They've withstood the test of time. Many of them have been around for, about almost as long as we've been doing IT security on a global level. They're very detailed, and they cover many specific domains. So there's, a standard within the ISO 27000 suite that's specifically for healthcare and specifically for banking. And so they're combining all of those creates this really massive compendium of controls, which is a good thing. The flip side of that is that because it is so comprehensive, it can become very costly to implement it, to manage it, and it can be very overwhelming for those that are trying to implement it. And so my view is that it's not right for all organizations. Surely, if you are supplying someone that requires you to be ISO 27001 certified, then of course you need to get audited to it and you need to implement it. If you are a very large organization that has extremely complicated IT systems, it might be right for you to implement it. You should at least consider doing so. But for most folks, it is so costly and so overwhelming to implement, unless they already have a pretty mature IT resource management operation, it's going to be very difficult for them to implement. So I'll contrast that with the NIST cybersecurity framework. So the NIST cybersecurity framework is just that. It's a framework. It's not a standard. It's not a set of controls. What it does is, as Sherry was saying, it helps you understand your risks at an organizational and strategic level. And so that means it's easier to communicate it to your C-suite, your executive level, your board of directors, and help them understand why you need to have this whole of organization approach to managing cybersecurity risks. That's very different than the story from ISO 27000. They function together, they complement each other, but ISO 27000 doesn't really have that aspect of communicating it at a non-technical level that allows you to tell a story that sounds like the other ways that a board manages risk. The fundamental role of a board of directors is to manage risk. And so if you want to have the resources and take the actions necessary to manage cybersecurity risk within your organization, you need to be able to present that to a board in a way that they can understand and that they can think about it in the same way that they do other types of risks that they manage throughout the organization. This was the fundamental reason that the cybersecurity framework exists. I was at NIST when the cybersecurity framework was developed and played a part in doing so in the background. And the reality is that it is an effort to tie business objectives in. And the history of it is that critical infrastructure in the United States was felt by many that it lacked a framework to think strategically about cybersecurity. So in many cases, they did implement audits for things like 27001, and they fulfilled their regulatory obligations. But that can be very different than managing risk as it pertains to your operation. And with a huge diversity of organizational types that operate as critical infrastructure, it's very hard to create a one-size-fits-all framework for that. And so to do so, you really need to abstract to how to think about risk and how to think about managing it at that strategic level. As Sherry mentioned, the cybersecurity framework is continuing to evolve. And the second iteration was very focused on making it easier to use, on adding additional topics of importance, which has occurred over time, like supply chain risk management, like how to measure cybersecurity. And so this is not something that was just put out there in 2014 and is going to live there for now. It's going to continue to evolve and continue to meet the risks or the needs of risk managers for cybersecurity. So the way, again, that I think about this is if you need to get audited for 27001 or any of the 27000 suite, then of course you need to implement 27001. And even if you're of the type of organization that it makes sense to implement 27000, it's still very likely worth doing the cybersecurity framework. It helps provide the why for all of the other investments that you're going to make. And if you are implementing 27001, you are going to make some significant investments. So it's really helpful to be thinking about that at an organizational level. Not just how does this fit into my IT organization, but how does this fit into my overall organization? How am I understanding the context of my business? And so I would recommend that anyone does the NIST cybersecurity framework, and that if it points to a need to do something as comprehensive as ISO 27001, then by all means do that as well.
Thank you, Mike. Sherry, you mentioned as one of the standards, the CIS top 20 controls. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of it?
Sure, Christian. Back in the early 2000s, I think network defenders and network operators were really becoming overwhelmed as attacks on networks grew, networks became more complicated, and they were trying to decide, what do we do? We don't have unlimited money. Where do we put our money? Where do we put our funding? And so what do we do to make our networks more secure? So the creators of the 20 controls, saw this confusion, and so they decided, okay, let's think about this problem and let's try to simplify it. They decided, okay, let's think about this. We're all on the same network. We basically use the same hardware, a lot of the same software, the same operating systems. What can we do? Let's try to focus on a very small number of things that will make a big, big difference. So the controls were developed with a consortium of global stakeholders, really using real data. They started out by looking at the attacks that had happened and trying to figure out what could have stopped those attacks from happening. So the idea also is by creating these controls, this standard set of things that we should do, that you're not really on your own, because now a whole ecosystem can grow up around those controls. The companies out there can develop training around the controls, can develop products and services to implement the controls. We have a common vocabulary to talk about the things that we want to do. And so they thought that would be really helpful to all of us practitioners as we try to secure our network. So the controls were put out there, and they've continued to be updated since that early time in the 2000s. We're currently on version 7. And the creators of the controls are now working on a version 8, which will be released sometimes in 2021. However, right now we have version 7, and I'd like to focus a little bit on version 7 and how we might use them. A key feature of version 7 was, instead of just putting out the 20 controls with all the definitions and the subcontrols, was that they decided to break them up into groups. So the 20 controls are divided now into 3 implementation groups. The first group is called the basic group, and it is a number of specific actions that can be taken to make your network more secure. They can be taken by large organizations, small organizations. They can be effectively implemented by organizations that do not have a huge budget, and really to have a significant impact. So this set of controls is basically equates to cyber hygiene. If you want to make your networks more secure and you want to practice good cyber hygiene, then you should start to implement this group 1, or the basic group. The Center for Internet Security has stated and has demonstrated that if you implement group 1, this basic group, that you should be well protected against the top 5 biggest attacks. They went to a number of different vendors, the Verizon Data Report, a number of those reports, and they took the top 5 attacks that happened over the last couple of years, and they went back and said, okay, if you have implemented a control group number 1, the basic group, would these attacks be successful against your network? And the answer is no. those attacks would not be successful. So this was a really good demonstration and proof, and I think well worth the money for the benefit that you get for implementing this basic group 1. And so I want to quickly go through what's in group 1, and as I go through there, you can just say, oh, that all is kind of simple. Yes, we can do that. So the first one is inventory and control of hardware assets, inventory and control of your software assets, vulnerability management on a continuous basis, controlled use of administrative privileges, secure configurations for hardware and software on mobile devices, laptops, workstations, and servers, maintenance, monitoring, and analysis of audit logs. So if you think about that and you look at the controls, all of those are pretty easy to implement and don't take a large amount of money to implement. And once you've done that, you can say that you have basic cyber hygiene. Quickly, I'll run through the second and third groups. The second group is called the foundational group, and it includes email and web browser protection, malware defenses, limitation and control of network ports, protocols, and services, data recovery capabilities, secure configuration for network defenses, boundary defense, data protection, and controlled access based on the need to know, wireless access control, and account monitoring and control. The third group really contains a number of organizational processes and things that you can do, and that includes the implementation of a security awareness and training program in your organization, application software security, incident response and management, conducting penetration tests, and red team exercises. Each of these controls is mapped against the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and the two organizations that manage the controls and the attack framework are today, as we speak, working together to ensure consistency. And each of them are participating in the continual evolvement of the other control. The 20 controls and the MITRE ATT&CK framework are also consistent with the NIST framework.
Thank you, Sherry. So, Mike, Sherry just mentioned about the MITRE ATT&CK framework. What is this, and how can an organization use it to improve its security posture?
Sure, yeah, happy to talk a little bit about that. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework was first developed about 8 years ago, and an organization in the US, based in the US called MITRE, was trying to actually execute a project of their own in which they were trying to build a scheme for defenses. And they realized that in order to do this, they had to really map what the attacks looked like to their defenses. And so as part of this, they started building this matrix. And they realized that it was such a valuable tool that they wanted to make it public, and it became the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So the idea here really is that it's designed to marry the offensive side of cybersecurity to the defensive side. So the attackers and what they're doing to the defenders. And so this is incredibly useful for threat modeling, so that you can say, okay, I've got my network, here are my controls, here's everything that I've implemented, what might happen? And threat modeling is that process of trying to come up with scenarios of what might actually occur, what attacks may be presented to you, what do the threat actors look like, what are their motivations, what are their capabilities, and so what can you expect to see on your networks if and when they come after you? And to what end? What are they trying to achieve? And so out of this, when they did a very rigorous job of this and made a very thorough mapping of the techniques, the objectives, and partly the attacker types. So an organization could use this for a number of reasons. They can use it for red teaming. They can use it for testing the maturity of their SOC. They can use it for their own intelligence. All of those things require a fairly significant level of maturity already in your cyber defenses. So while a good goal is to be at a point in your organizational maturity that you're using the MITRE ATT&CK framework, that really is a future activity. If you're not very mature, you need to implement these defenses first, based on either risk assessments that you're conducting yourself, or based on common risk assessments in the industry, or the common sets of controls like implementing the implementation group 1 from the Center for Internet Security, 20 controls. There are a number of different things that you really need to do as a precursor before the MITRE ATT&CK framework is going to be useful. Once you have reached a fairly strong level of defensive posture, the MITRE ATT&CK framework can help you test it. So it can really help you with defensive gap assessments. It helps you understand what the attacker might do, how you would go about detecting it, what mitigations you could implement, and then it also provides references to get more information, because you should, by the time you're really using it and to use it effectively, you should be talking about some pretty sophisticated actions and that are really kind of carefully thought out scenarios. And so you may need to dig quite a bit deeper to implement mitigations for them. Another thing that it's useful for is if there has been an attack, it can help you reverse engineer it. Okay, so I know that this outcome occurred. I know that, for instance, I had some boundary defense issues. What types of attacks might result in boundary defense issue, and how can I walk that back to understand what type of attack might have actually occurred? And so you can, in this way, use the matrix to reverse engineer what these attacks are, understand what the attackers may have done, and in a sense create a reverse engineered forensic trail that lets you understand whether they have multiple attacks that they've executed in order to get to whatever final outcome you're now observing, or whether what you're observing might be in the middle, and so there's something else going down in the attack chain. So it is an extremely useful tool, but it's limited really in use to folks that are at a fairly advanced stage in terms of their maturity. And again, as Sherry mentioned, all of these standards, guidelines, and control sets, they work together and they're built together. So it is, as you mature, very much possible to move from one to the next. And if you're careful and strategic about how you're doing this, all of these resources can help you reach an extremely high level of maturity in terms of defensive posture.
Okay, Christian, I lost audio. Can you hear me? Okay, because I can't hear you at all, but I think you asked me how, if you're an organization, how do you start implementation? What do you do if you're trying to begin a cybersecurity program? Is that correct? Okay, so the 20 controls were actually created for just this purpose. As I mentioned earlier, they were created by folks who recognized that some folks were overwhelmed by just this big cybersecurity problem and what we would need to do to solve that. So again, what they tried to do is focus on a small number of actions that would have a really big impact and make a big difference. And that's why version 7, which is the most current version, assigns the controls to groups. And so the basic group, which is group 1, applies to everyone, as we said earlier, even those that don't have significant resources. So to begin your cybersecurity program, or if you already have a program and you want to know where to take your program next, how to make your network more secure, I would suggest that an organization start with the Center for Internet Security's basic controls, their group 1. And as I mentioned, as you successfully implement group 1, or as you attempt to implement group 1, there's an entire ecosystem of products, services, tools that will support your implementation. And there's also training that goes along that can support your implementation of group 1. And as we move toward the implementation of group 1, you move toward implementation of good cyber hygiene on your network. And most people use the thumbnail sketch that if you maintain good cyber hygiene on your network, then at a minimum, 80% of the attacks that we know about today, and the number may actually be higher than that, will not be effective against your network. So that is a pretty good use of your money to be able to block out 80 or more % of the attacks that attackers might use against your network. Then once you've implemented some of this basic group and you have that underway, then as Mike suggested, you can move over and begin to look at the NIST framework, look at what will identify you, and then use that NIST framework to guide the identification and characterization of your risk assessment in your network. Once you've done that, you can go to the controls and begin to implement a few more of those and understand what you need to do there in order to continue your cybersecurity program. And then, as Mike talked about, once you have a cyber program, then perhaps you will bring in the MITRE ATT&CK framework for red teaming, penetration testing, etc. And as you recall, those are things that are in implementation group 3. But again, a good way to start is to begin to look at the basic group of those 20 controls, look at the products and services that support them, look at the training that supports them, and begin your program that way.
Thank you, Sherry. So, Mike, we have been talking all about these standards, and we need to implement them. So what would be some common pitfalls that we should be aware of when implementing these standards?
Yeah, there are many. And if you're an organization that doesn't feel that you're very mature in terms of implementing these controls, and you feel overwhelmed, don't be concerned. It's how everyone feels, I think, for organizations that haven't been doing this at a high level for a long time. And even those organizations feel overwhelmed at times. So I think the most important advice that I could give is to get to work on things, of course, but don't jump in aimlessly. And it's very easy initially to say, oh, wow, we've got a lot of work to do. We have so much we have to accomplish, and we only have so much time and so much in resources to get it done. And so we better go, and we better start checking boxes. But if you don't know where you are, and you don't know where you plan to go, and you don't have a plan to get there, then you're not going to take the right road. And so it's important to sequence what you're doing and really think about it in terms of making incremental steps on a very long journey. And so, as Sherry mentioned, you can start with this implementation group 1. And as she read off that list of some of the things that are in implementation group 1, the first ones really are about getting to know yourself. Know what your hardware assets are. Know what your software assets are. Know where things are. Understand what you are already doing, what your system already looks like. So as you start to get through some of these initial controls, maybe some of this stuff you're already doing, and that's good. Maybe some of it you're doing, but not as well as you should be, and so you just need some minor changes. That's also good. And then when you start to get an understanding of what you're supposed to be doing and what you're supposed to be implementing in some of these very basic controls, then you can step back and say, okay, at least I know what my posture looks like today. I know what I have. I know what my assets are. I know how well I'm maintaining them in terms of just keeping track of them. And so now I can start thinking more strategically. So you can kind of go back and forth between the CIS controls and the cybersecurity framework at that point, and start to walk through the framework and say, all right, now at a strategic level, I'm starting to understand what my organization looks like. What does that mean for me? And so now you're taking this strategic approach to implementing more of the CIS controls. And you can kind of continue along that path. And instead of just frantically trying to check boxes, then you're actually going to make a much greater incremental progress. And especially if you're out purchasing solutions, you don't want to purchase solutions that 50% of what they do is the same as a solution you already have, because now you're paying twice for controls that you don't need more of. Or maybe you have gaps associated with it. So if you're not paying attention to where you need to go, you're not going to make wise investments. Another common pitfall is thinking that you're done. And of course, we all know that when we're practitioners in cybersecurity or in IT, that things are always evolving, but it's important to communicate that. It's important not to make your management or your board think, well, all we need to do is buy this next tool and then we're good. You can't set that expectation. It's a continual evolvement. And we will mitigate a lot of risk by doing this next thing, and we'll be able to think about what the evolving threats are and think about what the world will look like and make decisions for the future. That's a much better message than we need to complete this checklist, because you will have to come back and say, oh, I mean also this checklist, because there's always more to do. Another thing that I see as a pitfall is failure to document what you're doing. And so very often in these controls, you know, the CIS controls, there are 20 broad categories, but within them, there's a total of about 180 total subcontrols. And so as you're implementing these subcontrols, you're going to come across ones that don't apply to you. It's just not part of your organization and your operations of what you do. And so you can skip that one. But you need to document what you're skipping and why, or how you're implementing it, or what a compensating control may be, something else you're doing that you believe mitigates that risk. And of course, you know, the current situation is an interesting example of that. You know, there are organizations that say, well, we focus very much on maintaining security within our network, and the way to do that is that we don't allow remote work at all, or maybe only for executives. Well, that was a perfectly fine approach up until 2020, and it's no longer a viable approach if you want to keep conducting any operations whatsoever. And so you need to have documentation to understand why you didn't implement certain controls related to remote access and authentication. And now what are you going to do about them? And didn't document them, didn't document your rationale, didn't document your compensating controls that made you think you didn't need to implement this specific subcontrol, then you're going to have a much harder time understanding why, understanding what you need to do to put yourself to mitigate risk and resume operations the way that you were doing so before. Another piece of this is really on understanding that sequential implementation. And that's really the value of the implementation groups. In these 20 controls, with these sub-controls within each of them, it was very common to hear organizations that were not very mature about, in their way of going about implementing the controls say, well, we're almost done with control 1. And once we get done with control 1, we'll move on to control 2. But that's not always the way that's right for your organization. It may be better to do some out of control 1, some out of control 2, some out of control 5. And so sequencing properly in a way that's right for your organization is extremely important. The implementation groups are a place to start with that. That's going to work for most organizations, but you need to be thinking about what your specific organization looks like. The other piece of this is assuming that you need to be really mature in order to implement the NIST cybersecurity framework. I heard that all the time when I worked at NIST, and I still hear it. There are some organizations that have done a very good job of implementing the framework and have published reports about how they did this, or what their portions of their completed framework. And U.S. Coast Guard did this, for instance, a multi-billion-dollar military organization. Intel Corporation did this, a multi-billion-dollar private sector technology company. And what they did is very sophisticated, and it's great, and you can learn a lot from it. But don't assume that you have to do something at that incredible level of depth and maturity. It's the point of the cybersecurity framework is that it's flexible enough to work with any organization. And so a lot of this is about self-awareness, understanding what's important in your organization and letting that drive what risks you need to mitigate. So again, if you think that way and you don't know where to start, it can create a problem. But if you start with these IGs that are there that work for the implementation groups that are there and work for most organizations, you start to build this awareness of yourself. And then you can iteratively start looking more and more at the specifics of your organization and understanding the types of risks that you need to mitigate, and use that flexibility in the CSF and use that flexibility in the CIS controls in order to implement a program that's right for you.
Talking about standards, the CIS Top 20, NIST Cybersecurity Framework, MITRE ATT&CK framework. However, Sherry, companies have to comply with a lot more standards than these, either for regulatory notions or some other reasons. What would you suggest these companies do when they are facing these type of compliance issues that they need to comply with a vast amount of standards?
So a lot of us have faced that or are facing that these days. And I've been involved in many situations where even if you could comply with every standard in the regulation and you could check the block, your system is still not secure. So I would suggest for those of you who are leaders out there, who work in the government, who are setting these regulations, please sit down and think about, the fact that we've called out these 3 standards which cover different parts of cybersecurity, cyber hygiene, cyber risk, and then how to test your system against network attacks. They're all consistent with each other. So I would suggest that you consider using these as, make these the regulatory standards, use these as your package because they have been demonstrated to work against the top attacks. So if you can go through and check off the blocks that you have implemented these things, then your system really is going to be more secure. For those of us who are practitioners and network defenders and operators, I would suggest that we try to band together and kind of have a grassroots level movement, which is actually how the 20 controls were created, was this grassroots movement to let our regulators know that, hey, we know all about the CIS 20 controls. We know all about the NIST framework. We know all about the MITRE ATT&CK framework. That's what we believe in. That's what's going to make our network more secure. And we would highly and strongly encourage you to adopt these as the regulation standards. I think in the US, we are moving toward that. We had the same issues that you just talked about, Christian, where there were standards out there. They were very difficult to implement. They were long. They were tedious. There were many of them. They were not consistent. And oh, by the way, even if you implemented them and could check the block, your network probably was not going to be secure against the attacks that we're seeing today. I think what's so important is if you do implement this group of standards, then you are implementing and you are going to be a lot safer to protect your networks and your data against these sophisticated attacks that we're seeing today. So I think we have to come at it from both directions. I think, if you are one of the people who create the regulations, then I'm really hoping that you paid attention tonight and that you're listening and that you'll think about moving in this direction. And for those of us who have to abide by the regulations, I say that we kind of get together and have this grassroots effort to let the regulators know that, hey, this is what works, this is what will make our networks more secure, and let's move in that direction. And if we can do that, then I think we will basically have a sort of golden control set that really covers the waterfront, that gives us good cyber hygiene, that allows us to measure our risk and to categorize it and to talk about it, and then that gives us the tools and that allows us the tools and techniques to measure how well these are working against our networks using the MITRE framework.
Reviewing some of the key points today, can you help us with that, Sherry, as final closing points?
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about a lot of things, but I'm just going to leave you, I'm going to highlight a few of the things, call out that we talked about that I'd like to leave you with. The first is that it's so important to have standards. Standards give us a common language to talk with. For years, that was a huge problem, that we were talking past each other. So it gives us a common language. It also allows us to learn from the lessons that others have learned, which of course not only makes our networks more secure, but it allows us to be more cost effective as we're trying to protect our networks. We're advocating that there's 3 standards that you need to know about and that you need to use and implement to protect your system. The Center for Internet Security's 20 controls, the NIST framework and the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And as we've already talked about numerous times, they're consistent with each other and they give you these capabilities across the board to actually use good cyber hygiene, to make your network more secure, to assess risk and talk about it, and then to actually test your network against the most sophisticated tactics and techniques that our adversaries are using out there. Sometimes we're overwhelmed, but to begin implementing our cybersecurity program, we can start with implementation group 1, or the basic group. And as Mike talked about, we're going to look at that group and do what makes sense for our network. There's an ecosystem of tools and technologies, of training, et cetera, that are out there to help us with that implementation. And therefore, you know, that it makes it a very logical place to start, because it is a relatively small group of actions that will make a huge difference in the security of our networks. We should determine what's important, what do we want to protect in our networks, what's important about our networks, and that will, as Mike talked about, will kind of guide us in how we want to implement these controls. We need to make a plan using these controls, using the NIST framework, identifying our risk. We can make a plan, and then we need to implement that plan to get there. The most important thing to remember is that we're not ever done. There's no one thing we can buy. There's no one action that we can take that will guarantee our networks to be secure for the next 10 years, even the next year, or even until tomorrow. It is a continuous process. But I think as the owners of these standards, as the owners of the 20 controls, the owners of the NIST framework, the owners of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, they are continuing to talk to all of the network owners and operators. They are continuing to evolve these controls, evolve these standards. And I think as we implement them and follow that, you know, it's a continuous process, but we will be able to make our networks more secure.
Sherry. Mike, any closing remarks for our audience tonight?
I think Sherry covered it pretty well. But you know, what's really important, I think, is there's a big human element of this, and there's a psychology of it. If you don't feel like you're in a good position from a cybersecurity perspective, that's okay. You can get better, and find someone who can help you with it. Be strategic about it, and know that every organization started in the same place and had to develop over time and had to figure out what worked for them. And so it's incredibly important to just step back and say, it's going to be okay. We're going to figure out how to do this. Let me get the right help and make progress.
My last thought is that cyber is a team sport. We shouldn't do it on our own. We have to really work together. We have to collaborate and share information. We have to share not only threat information, but we need to share good practices, good hygiene. We have to share these mitigation information. And it really has to be among industry, between industry and government, and among industry, government, and academia, because it really is going to take all of us to do this thing and to make our networks more secure. So just remember, it's a team sport. We need to work this together.
Harry. Me voy a pasar a español. Como hemos visto, hay 3 estándares de que podemos seguir para realmente mejorar nuestra postura de seguridad. Tenemos el NIST Cybersecurity Framework, el CIS Top 20 y el MITRE ATT&CK Framework, para que podamos utilizarlos para mejorar nuestra postura de seguridad. Acá en SISAP hemos utilizado el estándar de NIST para alinear todos nuestros servicios a que vayan con el estándar, para que cuando se los entreguemos a ustedes, vayan alineados a NIST. En este momento vamos a tomar algunas preguntas. Si tienen alguien, y con mucho gusto la pueden hacer en el área de preguntas y se las daremos a los panelistas. Bueno, aparentemente no tenemos ninguna pregunta. Gracias a todos por estar en la primera charla del Advanced Cybersecurity Series. Nos vemos el jueves. Gracias. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
Gracias.
Thank you for having us. Good night.